The advance of Australian forces over ground just evacuated by the Japanese when Kokoda was recaptured and the enemy driven out. An observation post used by the tree-climbing Japs. Artillery brought up an inch at a time by muscle power through the jungle ravine known as the Gap. These guns were flown by fortresses from Australia to Port Moresby, then in sections by smaller aircraft, and finally hauled into battle through countries such as you see here. Jap wounded left to die by their comrades are brought in by Australians out on patrol. These are sidelights from the Owen Stanley mountain area. By driving the Japs out of the Gap, down to the plains and back to the sea at Boona, the immediate threat of a battle for Australia was averted. The success of this operation is as important a victory as any elsewhere in this war.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second episode in my special series of interviews with Kokoda veterans. I absolutely love doing this. I love speaking to veterans. It's by far the most enjoyable part of my job. There is nothing like sitting down with someone who was there and who fought in these wars. If you have the opportunity yourself, go and do it. Speak to a veteran. I mean, move fast. If you're going to speak to a World War II veteran, we're running out of them at a huge rate. It's a very sad thing. But speak to a Vietnam veteran. Speak to anyone in your family or anyone that you know who served in a war. I promise it'll give you a remarkable new insight into these important chapters of history. Today, we're going to be talking to Lloyd Birdsall, and I was lucky to speak with Lloyd in his home. He's a lovely man, and he's got some remarkable insights into his service because he served in the artillery during the Pacific War, and we hear a lot about the infantry. We hear a lot about hand-to-hand combat on the Kokoda track. We hear about all these famous infantry actions, but we spend less time thinking about the support troops, the artillery, the transport, the signallers, the people who kept the army moving, who kept these battles going on. There would have been no battles without the support troops. And Lloyd had some fantastic insights into those battles he served in the Pacific War, and also to the war in general and what it means to have served in a war like this. So I really hope you enjoy this episode. Let's hear from Lloyd Birdsall.
A fate which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack.
This was their finest hour.
Lloyd, it's a real privilege to be sitting here talking to you. I always really enjoy speaking to veterans about their experiences because they're always really different. You can talk to two veterans from the same unit and they have a very different experience. So thank you very much for sharing these your memories with us of the war.
Thank you for the invitation.
So why don't you tell us a little bit? You're a Sydney boy from way back. So what was the situation during the war? How did you come to be in the service?
The government decided that all our troops were overseas fighting the Germans and the Italians, and we were very short of an army. So in 1940 or 41, they decided to call up everybody between the ages of 18 and 40 who were not doing war work and to get a new army together. I fell into the category of working as an apprentice electrician, but we were doing just standard work around the place and not any contribution to the war industry. So I had to enlist, and I did, and they called me up 2 weeks after my 18th birthday for full-time service in the AMF. It's often referred to as the militia. It was not militia, it was full-time AMF. Militia was only part-timers, and that was abandoned at that stage, but they still talk about us chocos, as we were called, as being militia, but we were never militia, we were full-time AMF, as distinct to the AIF.
So as a young bloke in Sydney at that time, what were your thoughts about the war? Did you think that the Japanese were on their way south? I mean, what did you think about the Japanese and the Germans, and what did you know about how the war was going?
We didn't know very much at 18 how interested was any boy at that time. That's all I was. And I was a little keen to get into the services. I thought it was some sort of an experience. I think you're not too well versed in ways of the world at that age. It was more of an excitement rather than anything else to worry about. The war, we didn't know too much because the Japanese hadn't affected us by this stage. They were still, had not even taken Singapore. They didn't take Singapore until February, and I was called up in January. So we were not particularly concerned about it because we thought Singapore was a safe foothold for the Brits and the Australians who'd already occupied it for protection against the rest of the world.
Did you have mates who'd gone off to the war? Did you know people who'd gone off to the war?
My brother played baseball and he played for Nestles, and a lot of the Nestles boys joined up in a bunch. The Nestles were at Abbotsford at that time. They joined up in a bunch and they all went to Singapore with the 8th Division. And I don't know if any of them ever come back or not. I really don't know. I never able to find out.
So you got called up?
Yes.
And so what unit did they put you in? How did you? What was your first experience of?
Well, as an apprentice electrician, they sent me out to the Army Trades Training Depot, which was out at Victoria Barracks. But there were so many people called up the one time we were all put into the showground. We slept in the grandstands of the showground on the concrete floor of the showground. That's where we slept. We were there for 3 weeks. And that was the time I was putting barbed wire on the beaches all along the coast of the southern beaches, right out as far as Maroubra and so on.
So you were part of a group putting wire on the suburban beaches of Sydney.
Exactly right. Exactly, yes. Nothing to do with electricians at all. But then after 3 weeks of that, they sent me to the 2nd Division Signals Maintenance Unit M section at Walgrove. I was there for about 3 weeks when they was trying to find a place to send me.
So this would have been because of your skills as an
electrician. Yes, that was the idea of being assessed as my ability. So they sent me to the 14th Field Regiment's signal section, about 30 men, and we were attached to the regiment. We ate with them and lived with them and so on as part of the group, but we had a different officer and we were under the control in general of the 14th Field Regiment Artillery. We've looked on them as our home unit, but we're attached personnel, which that happened a lot in the army. And after I was there for about 3 days, they then sent me down back to where I came from out at the showground for a trades test to see if I was qualified as a signals electrician. So after I was qualified for that, they sent me back then at full time back to the signals section with the 14th Field Regiment, and I stayed with them for the next 2 years.
So the 14th Field Regiment, they're an artillery unit, obviously. It's 25-pounders, was the
25-pounders, yes.
So tell me a little bit about that. I mean, tell me about the guns and how many crew were on each gun, and tell me about the structure of the regiment.
There's usually 5 or 6 usually 6 on the gun, the sergeant, then you have a gun layer, and then you have the various blokes bringing up the shells and putting them in the breech and closing the breech, and then the firing the gun, and done by the gun. I don't know what the exact positions are now, but there's about 6 on the gun crew. The range of a gun was around about 9 miles, going back to about 13 kilometres, I suppose, there. And the gun is what they call a gun howitzer. It's a field gun, but with elevating the barrel upwards, it can become a howitzer which fires over mountains and so on in a lobbing type of range. So probably classified as the best field artillery of the whole of the war. And as far as made and designed in England, ours were made out here in Australia in the railway workshops, and also Maribyrnong gun factory down in Victoria. They sort of made pieces here and there and assembled them at various locations, but ours were all Australian made. Very beautiful, accurate guns they were.
So your job as a signalman with the artillery was to communicate with the infantry and to
my job, our section, there were about 30 of us, were made up of Donars, dispatch riders, 4 or 5 of those. We had 4 trucks with radios in them, which were no good up in the islands. They were not very good. we had a line-laying crew, and myself, my job was maintaining any radio sets and telephones and so on, and maintaining. Now, our job in our signal section was to maintain communications mainly between our batteries, headquarters, forward to brigade headquarters. We're the middlemen. The batteries had their own signalmen between gunners and so on. They did their own work. We trained a lot of them. And then our job was to go, we might say, the rear echelon, maintaining the lines backwards to headquarters.
But that's a pretty important job because the guns can't be blind, can they, to do their
right.
work? Yeah.
Exactly. I'd say signalling is a very important job. We lost a couple of our fellows to the coast watchers. They went off for them, and they were away for about several months, and then they came back to us again. And they had positions overlooking Japanese bases, air bases or naval bases or whatever, reporting back. I mean, letting us know in Port Moresby there's a certain number of planes heading towards us at such and such a time. So we had a fair chance of getting our planes off the ground and the artillery ready and so on.
It's pretty dangerous work, that coast watching work.
Well, that's right. There were a few coast watchers were captured. Some of them were dobbed in by the natives. Others were protected by the natives. A lot of the natives had their own opinions about white man. Some were for us and some were against us, and I believe they had the right to be judges. We were in their country, so I don't criticise the ones that dobbed us in, but we were very thankful for the ones who certainly helped us.
So it's 1942, and so your unit was sent to New Guinea. Is that the case?
That's right. We left Sydney Harbour on the 26th of June 1942, and we arrived in Port Moresby non-stop on the 5th of July. Sunday evening at 5 o'clock on the 5th of July, we pulled into Sydney, into the harbour, about 9 o'clock before we got off the ship.
We don't often think about, with Kokoda in particular, the track and the difficulties the infantry had. We don't often think about artillery, particularly from the Australian point of view. So what was your job when you went over there? How did you, what did they tell you about the work you were going to be doing? What were you expected to do when you arrived in New Guinea?
We'd get jobs day by day. Our line crew were probably the busiest of the lot. They laid lines all over the place to keep the communication. So you have 5 different batteries. You've got headquarters, then you've got 53, 54 and 55 battery. 4 batteries that is, isn't it? 53, 54, 55 and headquarters. And they have to maintain the communications between each other, which we had to make sure they were working all right. And radios were not much good at all because we're only talking to each other. Really, you couldn't take them anywhere. It was just local, so you might as well ring up on the phone and talk ordinary language over the phone because we didn't have any worries in that regard.
Now, your regiment was involved in a really important action, but one that gets a little bit overlooked quite late in the Japanese advance, wasn't it? So the Japanese had advanced across the Owen Stanleys and were within sight of Port Moresby, and then your guns came up and played a really important role, didn't they?
That's right.
So tell us about that.
Yes, well, we took the guns about 30 miles out of Port Moresby as far as Owers Corner. Now, we're trying to think of the end of the road, and then we had to cut a track from the end of the road as far as Owers Corner, which is another several kilometres, cut it through the jungle. And
these are big guns, aren't they?
These
are not
guns.
easy to move
yes,
around.
You have to cut a road, you might say. Anything a truck will go, you need it as wide as a truck to get the guns through. And with the assistance of the 2nd, 1st
Pioneers,
2nd, 1st Pioneers, they were great helpers getting their guns up there. They loaned us all sorts of pulley blocks and ropes and man labour and all that sort of thing.
So you did it by hand? You pulled the guns up by hand?
All done by hand. All the trees had to be cut down by hand. They cut the track and all that. They had chainsaws and stuff like that we never thought of. Anyway, we dragged it up probably another best part of 10 k's, to a position as far as we could get overlooking the valley. And
because these were pretty desperate days, weren't they?
They were desperate days. The Japanese were invincible. It seemed that our infantry were being pushed back all the time. Every time you get the news on the radio or by voicemail, we'd find out the Japanese were still advancing. Our infantry couldn't hold them for a long time. We were outnumbered so much. They were ready and we were not. That's what it boiled down to. And the 39th Battalion, they took a terrible hammering until the 2nd, 14th, and then the 7th Division arrived. And once they arrived and strengthened our infantry, they stopped the Japanese. And then when they arrived as far as Ira, we had our gun observation post on Imita Ridge, which is across the valley from Ira, and our guns had gone across the valley again. And we were firing from Over's Corner over our heads, and we had one officer and dragged some telephone lines with him. There were a couple of the gunners out of the regiment, not us, but the gunners out of the regiment, and they got right up almost onto the Japanese lines. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them talking, and he brought down the fire right on top of them. That they found out later on. The Japanese took that for 2 or 3 days. We opened up on I think it was September the 22nd, I think it was, that we brought the guns to bear on the Japanese. Not 100%, I think it was 22nd of September. We've dropped 600 rounds on them, and that decided them that they would, and the word that they got was there's no such word as retreat in the Japanese language, apparently. They were to advance to the rear. That was the letter that went out from the general, advance to the rear. And they did, they started to pull back. But they were in a desperate situation. They were short of food, they were short of medicine, they were short of everything. They were in a terrible way. They had absolutely reached their limit. There's no question about it. They were still prepared to fight, but they had reached the limit almost of their endurance. They were in a terrible mess.
I think it's really interesting, Lloyd, because you almost downplay the significance of this, but it was such an important moment in the campaign because the Japanese had come across. They were looking at Port Moresby. From all accounts, the Japanese were very excited that they could now see Port Moresby in the distance. And it was your guns that convinced them that an attack on Port Moresby was a waste of time.
That's right. Exactly right. Yes. We did know, and the infantry said to us they'd been listening to a Japanese gun, a 3-inch mountain gun. The Japanese used to take the wheels off it and then the barrel off it, carry it forward 100 metres or 200 metres, reassemble it, fire on the unit, the Australians, and then advance and do it. The same thing. They'd been listening to that gun and been pelted by it for months, you might say, and they said that the sweetest sound they ever heard was our shells going over. They sound like a train whistling as the shells go over your head. They said the sweetest sound they'd ever heard. Yeah, so we were pleased to hear that too.
But there was so you had 2 guns at Ower's Corner, but there was a 3rd gun that you dragged even further forward, wasn't
that's
there?
Right. There's a 3rd one. We pulled it apart, put the barrel on the sled, stripped the steel cover off the front of it, left that behind, and dragged the wheels, the carriage and that forward, and reassembled it just at the foot of the Owen stand, the Golden Stairs, as you call it. We couldn't get it up as far as Imita Ridge. We couldn't get it that far up, but we were firing over the ridge onto Irabara, which was the next valley across. That we reassembled it, but it never got into action because by this time the Japanese had started their retreat and they were out of range. So we often wonder what happened to that gun, whether we ever brought it back. I don't know.
It's probably still up there in the jungle.
No, it must have been brought back because we had to account for everything like that. You couldn't lose a 25-pounder without knowing where it went.
Well, it's really, I really enjoy hearing that story, Lloyd, because, as I said, that's one of the unknown chapters of the story. It's one of the overlooked parts of the story, and it's so important, these final days of the Japanese advance before we then turned around and started pushing them back. So it's really wonderful to hear from your perspective about this really significant action that you took place in. What happened after that? Back down to Port Moresby?
Back to Port Moresby, and then the powers that be decided we would go to Milne Bay and join up with the 9th Division and prepare for the attack on Lae to follow the Japanese up the coast on the north side of New Guinea. So the 2nd 6th Field Regiment, they'd been in action down in Milne Bay during the Milne Bay campaign when the Japanese were kicked out, which I would point out to everybody was the first time the Japanese had ever been defeated on the land. The Yanks like to say it was a Guadalcanal, but the Guadalcanal was still going on for many weeks after we cleaned the Japanese out of Milne Bay, and we believe that the remnants of Milne Bay went to Guadalcanal as reinforcements, but we don't know for sure. We only just believe so. So we then went down to Milne Bay and swapped over the guns of the 2nd 6th. They'd been overseas in the Middle East and so on. We took their guns and they took over our guns that were in Port Moresby. What happened to the 2nd 6th after that, I don't know. I believe they went on further up into the islands later, but of course you don't keep in touch with them. But we went down to Milne Bay, took over all their gun positions and waited down there until everybody was ready to go advance by ship up the coastline and land at Lae, which was in September, I think, next year, September.
Milne Bay was always a fairly primitive outpost in New Guinea. What was it like when you were there?
I think it's the worst place on God's earth. It stunk of mosquitoes and mud and rain and rats and, the rats were as big as cats down there in Milne Bay. They were dreadful. We were living in a coconut plantation and the Americans turned it into a submarine base after we left there, but they didn't last long because they kept moving up with the advancing Americans anyway. But they did have a submarine base there after we left. But the worst place on God's earth, I thought I'd go mad living amongst these. You see the rats, and we used to catch them in our tents, and oh dear, dreadful place. I went back there twice. I went back in 1982 and I went back in 2005. In 82 there was nothing changed. In 2005 it was built up to tar roads and it became quite a headquarters for that, Alatow they call it now, the headquarters of that particular area.
So you're at Milne Bay and then they packed you up, and where did they send you after that?
Then they sent us up to Lae. We made an advance on Lae by barges and so on, an amphibious landing. We took our guns up there, but they never fired a shot because the Japanese retreated as soon as the infantry landed. The Japanese took off up the coastline to Finchhaven and Alexishaven. They went north along the coastline. They didn't wait to fight. They just consolidated, I suppose you'd put it, and they knew they couldn't hold us off, so they just retreated to strengthen what they had.
And so how long were you up at Lae for before you moved on to the next place?
We landed in Lae in April, Anzac Day we left Port Moresby, so we landed 2 days afterwards on the ship overnight, I think it was a day and a night. And then we left there in January 44 to come home, January 44.
Okay, so tell me about that. So they sent you back from New Guinea back to Australia?
Back to Australia, and then they sent us to Warwick in Queensland, and the snow... It was the coldest place, we thought, after being almost 2 years in New Guinea. They put us in Warwick, which was close to freezing, it seemed to be, even though we were still February and we were in Warwick for several months and it got colder all the time and we just seemed to freeze. I don't know why we seemed to be so cold, but we were. Anyway, they disbanded then, the powers that be disbanded the 2nd Division. There's several brigades who were all scattered around the place, and we were one of them, the 14th Brigade. They were dissolved into other units, and the 2nd Division became nothing at all. They just wiped it off the register of active troops, I suppose. I don't know. They've got terminology for it. So then I was then sent to the 2nd 9th Armoured Regiment, which was part of the 4th Brigade, and I was attached to the 4th Brigade Signal Section. still as a signals electrician, but this time instead of working around guns and telephones and still working around the tanks, my job was making sure the radios were working in the tanks and so on, as well as telephones and much of the same thing, but more in the radio. I didn't know too much about radio sets, but we had a workshop that used to fix them. I used to test them, and if they didn't work, I'd replace them and so on and send them back to workshop and let them work on them. But my job was make sure they work while they're in the tanks.
So these were Matilda tanks?
Matildas.
Okay.
And while we're on Morotai, this is the thing that I'm surprised never happened earlier. We had the workshops welded some steel boxes on the back of the tank, right above one of the rear tracks on the back of the tank. And in that box, we put a telephone. No dial tone or anything, like just a handpiece hanging on a hook inside. So the infantry pick that up and talk immediately to the crew commander inside the tank, which means if you said there's a machine over there, machine gun giving us trouble, 20 degrees to your ports or wherever, over there in that shrub of trees, there'd be a fire on it, and then they give directions to the tank, which they couldn't do before except by radio sets. And this we thought was a marvellous invention, but it was so late in the war before somebody thought of it.
Well, it's a sensible idea. I mean, they still do it today. It's still an operation today.
Yeah,
So you're at Morotai, and then where to?
We were in Morotai for 6 weeks, and while we're on Morotai, we had to waterproof all our jeeps, put grease all over the carburettors and extended the carburettors up above the bonnet level if you thought it was going to be deep water, but mostly it was waterproofing the engine so it could keep going, and they did underwater, some of them.
So you're really part of this campaign now of island hopping, aren't you? Following the Japanese as they retreated. So where did you go to next? What was the next?
Well, from there, Labuan Island, we stayed on Labuan Island for about 6 weeks, I think it was. Then they moved us across to the mainland at Mempickle, a little town. Actually, Mempickle was part of a cable station that ran through the Borneo. I don't know too much about that. I know there was a underground cable and the cable house and all that sort of thing there, but I never had anything to do with that. And they landed us there ready to take advances on the mainland of Borneo, but by this time their campaign had just about wound up anyway through the various landings. I was with B Squadron. We landed at Labuan. A Squadron landed at a different part of the Borneo, and C Squadron also at a third part. I can't even think of the names now. I should know them. The Japanese were so well dug into what they called the pocket on Labuan Island, they held out for about 3 weeks in this pocket. And we were shelling them with the 25-pounders at night time, and we were being shelled by an 8-inch cruiser, I think it was the Australia, standing off the coast at daytime. So we had to have the observation gunners, and they landed shells all day and all night on this pocket. And it was not all that big, only a few hundred metres in size, and about 200 Japanese they estimated. And we couldn't get them out because they were so deeply dug in. All we were doing was stirring up the dirt on top of them. So anyway, the powers that be decided we'd bring a flamethrower across from the mainland. They call them a frog, F-R-O-G. I don't know what the initials stand for. Firing object, something or other, you know. Anyway, we bought one of these flamethrower tanks across from the mainland, ran it up to the pocket, and within about half an hour, they went all around the hill with this flamethrower, pointing it down the holes in the ground, and within half an hour, that was it. There's no sign of any resistance. So then they got a bulldozer tank with a blade on the front of it, and they sent it up on the top of these hills, and they just scooped it all and buried them where they were, just pushed it all down over spread it out like a football field all around. It took the top off the hill and just levelled it all out. And I don't know if any of those bodies were ever recovered out of that hill. I have no idea whatsoever whether the Japanese went back and got them out. I don't know. That's a puzzle to me. But that was interesting how quick the flamethrowers finished it up. They'd been shelled for 3 weeks, and the flamethrowers went in and fixed it up in half an hour. So that's the story of the flame. They're dreadful things, those flamethrowers. Oh, they're shocking. The noise of roaring, it's like a blow lamp, and roaring noise and this great flame shooting out. It's horrible. The worst things ever invented, I think. And not only do they burn the bodies, it sucks up all the oxygen out of the trench and you smother. If you don't get burnt, you still suffocate one way or the other. Dreadful. Oh, the war ended by the time then. The war ended. And we were put on parade in front of Mountbatten. He came along and lined us all up and said, sorry, I can't send you home. I've got to wait till the Gurkhas are ready to take over your position, because we're looking after Japanese by this time. We had the compounds with Japanese in them, and they had nothing to do. You had to march them around all day just to keep them happy. If they were being told to do something, they were all right, but leave them alone, they didn't know what to do. If you took your shirt off, it'd disappear and it'd come back 10 minutes later cleaned and ironed. They were looking for things to do that all the time. We were treated as if we were officers, because they had nothing to do at all.
What was it like when you heard the news that the war was over?
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. Everybody had had enough, everybody. The guns were going off, people were shouting and cheering and carrying on, and it was a great feeling to know that it was all over. But we had to wait another 4 months to January before we could come home. The Americans owned all the ships, and we had to wait to get a ship they were using to take their own transport home, to take their own troops back first. Anyway, we had to wait according to Mountbatten. We had to wait till he brought his troops up. He said they'll look like being away from home for at least 2 years, and he said they'll miss next Christmas. And we thought, well, we'd already missed 4 Christmases. How come they get priority? We couldn't understand that. We could not get that after being all whatever we'd all been through, and they got the priority. We were not pleased.
So, Lloyd, you during your service, you saw quite a few different campaigns. You did Kokoda and then the North Coast of New Guinea, Borneo. What was the hairiest moments you experienced in your time?
I think the hairiest moment was when we were bombed by 14 Japanese planes just outside of Port Moresby, up at 14 Mile, they call it. There was a 14-mile airstrip, and we don't know to this day whether they were bombing the airstrip or they were bombing us. But they were using what they call daisy cutters, because you can tell from the hole in the ground it's no shallower than about a foot deep, and then it spreads out and it'll cut trees down about a foot or 18 inches above ground level, and the range only 25 metres all around. The shrapnel would chop these trees down. That's why they were called daisy cutters. Now, they were all used through our camp. Unfortunately, we were protected by a hill, a bit of a hill of land, and most of their bombs landed on the right side of the hill, we'll call it, and by the time the shrapnel went over the hill, it just chopped our water tank to pieces and damaged a few of our trucks and holes through our tents and things like that, and very little damage to no injuries to anybody. We were lucky that way. But sitting in the hole when the bombs are landing within 20, 30 feet of you, it's a bit hairy. That's probably the most scary thing that I can think of. Another time was sitting on top of a tank changing the aerials, which had been shot off the tank, and the Australian soldiers were mortaring the Japanese over the top of our tank. I could hear them going off on the one side and landing on the other side. I didn't like that very much because the Japanese were pretty keen on sniping. They send the snipers up trees everywhere.
So you're on top of the tank?
I was sitting on top of the tank with a beautiful target, yes. So nothing came of that though, but it feels a bit creepy up the back of your neck when you know you could be under a sniper sight somewhere.
So how do you look back on the war now, all these years later? What do you think about the people you served with and the war, and how do you look back on that whole chapter of your life?
I think it was very important that we saved New Guinea and Milne Bay, part of that campaign. very important. We didn't know, and nobody will ever know, whether the Japanese intended to land in Australia or not. But sitting at Port Moresby, it would have been a constant threat, and it would have given them a great bombing base to bomb the Americans at Guadalcanal too, which is not very far away. It would have been a great advantage to the Japanese if they had taken it. From what I've read from those that know, the Japanese had reached the end of their tether. The Navy said they couldn't give them the ships to land a big enough force to invade Australia. That's one of the stories that you hear. The others say that the infantry were too busy in other locations. They couldn't supply the men to land in Australia. It would have been a token force and which would not have gone very far. But that certainly creates a lot of panic in Australia at that time. So I'm not too sure, but it was certainly... But the rest of the island hopping, I think that was an absolute waste of time and lives. There's no need for that. The Americans had gone round them by this time. They'd cut them off. They could sit there starving. Wouldn't have mattered. We didn't have to take the islands. You could have just let them sit. What could they do? They had the Rabaul was their main supply for round about New Guinea and Guadalcanal and places like that. You only had to take one place, but even then Rabaul was cut off. So I think this island hopping was a sheer waste of manpower and lives and, well, I don't think it did any good. Not really.
And what do you think about the Japanese today, looking back?
I went to Japan not long after the war ended in I forget now exactly, 60, something like that, and met a few of the Japanese and to learn their outlook on life and things like that. They were all shoveled into the war. They didn't really want it. All their peasants want to work their farms and things like that. They didn't really want the war, but the emperor said so they had to go. He was king, he was God, he was everything. So, but it wasn't the emperor so much as the militant type of generals and naval admirals. They're the ones that wanted pushing for the war as far as I can see. But the Americans pushed them into it with their bans on their income, because they were fighting China for many years before we got into the war, and they were short of materials. They didn't have oil, they didn't have the iron ore, they had to get it from some other part of the world, and America said you're not going to get it to get out of China. And of course the Japanese either had to get out of China, which they didn't want to do, or fight the Americans. So the Americans pushed them into it, that's all you can say. They had no alternative except... so this is all political, and I'm not prepared to judge anybody politically. They seem to know more than I do about politics.
What about on a personal level with there's obviously a lot of talk about the, atrocities committed against Australian prisoners and things. How do you think personally about the Japanese?
That I will never forgive them for that. There's no need for that. I do understand up in the islands that the Japanese were very short of food. They were living on a handful of rice, so they didn't have much to spare for the Australians, but they definitely committed eating the soldiers when they caught them.
Cannibalism.
Cannibalism. They definitely, there's no question about that. They cannibalised some of the bodies that we found up there. And that's not a thing, but the way they treated our soldiers in the prisoner of war camps and things like that, I think that was extreme, and that was not necessary. They could have fed them a little better, and they didn't have to kill them with work and so on. I mean, that is non-forgivable. But that's history. The ones who did that are all gone. You might say there's a few like me, a few oldies left, but the young ones don't understand this today. They don't talk about it over there. The young ones don't know too much about they know that they're a militant nation, but they certainly don't know of the atrocities. They don't talk about that. Nobody, as far as I can work out, they didn't know too much at all.
What's your hope for the future as someone who's a war veteran who's been through the tough times? I mean, what do you hope we've learnt from the Second World War, and what do you hope it means for the future?
I can't say that we learnt as much as we should have. Otherwise, we wouldn't be fighting. How many wars are going on in the world today? There's about 30 of them, civil wars and uncivil wars, as I call them. I don't understand why people can't settle down and spend the money on hospitals and welfare of the people. We could live in this world a beautiful life if people would only devote themselves to it. But you've got to say that the gun suppliers are at the trouble. I mean, Australia's now selling guns all around the world. Why do we have to do that? We buy them from America and then we sell them to Indonesia or somewhere. I don't believe it, and I'm a bit of a pacifist. I can't understand why we have to keep fighting. We just don't learn. We just don't seem to learn.
Well, I think everyone listening to this would certainly agree with you, and I think everyone would agree that it's been fascinating to hear your stories about your time in the war. So, Lloyd, thank you very much. It's been really wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you. Yes, I left a couple of schoolmates up in New Guinea, and every time I think of them, I get a little nostalgic. Can't help that. But they paid the price. Thank you anyway for your interviewing. Much obliged. I hope people learned something from what I had to say. Thank you.